Hi, fourth graders. I'd like to continue reading chapter 12 and continue into 13. So if you could just listen and get comfortable, we can do it this way. Okay. So we left off with that evening she stood for hours on a stool under the chute in their kitchen, pretending she was practicing to get a feeling when really she was listening to Mrs. Driver's conversations with Crampfurl. All she learned was that Mrs. Driver's feet were killing her and that it was a pity that she hadn't given her notice last May. And would Crampfurl have another drop, considering there was more in the cellar than anyone would drink in her lifetime? And if they thought she was going to clean the first floor windows single-handedly, they had better think again. But on the third night, just as Arrietty had climbed down off the stool before she overbalanced with weariness, she heard Crampfurl say, "Well, if you ask me, I'd say he had a ferret." And quickly Arrietty climbed back again, holding her breath. "A ferret?" she heard Mrs. Driver say. "Whatever next? Where would he keep it?" "That I wouldn't like to say," said Crampfurl in a rumbling, earthy voice. "All I know is that he was up beyond going around all the banks and calling like down all the little rabbit holes. Well, I never. Oh, my goodness. A ferret? Did they really have a ferret? But I guess I'd seen them before." There was a gulp, as though Crampfurl was taking a sip of a drink. "Yes," he said, "I had seen a ferret," and Arrietty heard him set down the glass. "A ferret? It was called Uncle something." Arrietty made a sharp movement, balanced for one moment with her arms waving, and then fell off the stool. There was a clatter as the stool slid sideways, banged against a chest of drawers, and rolled over. "What was that?" asked Crampfurl. There was silence upstairs, and Arrietty held her breath. "I didn't hear anything," said Mrs. Driver. "Yes," said Crampfurl. It was under the floor, like there by the stove." "That's nothing," said Mrs. Driver. "It's just the coals falling. Often sounds like that. Scares you sometimes when you're sitting here alone. Here, pass your glass. There's just a drop left. Finish it, please." Arrietty could see through the light in the crack. Occasionally it flicked with a shadow as one person or another moved a hand or an arm. "Yes," went on Crampfurl, returning to his story, "and when I come up with my gun, all innocent, and I see any of these ferrets—" "Wait a second," said Mrs. Driver, and laughed. "You wouldn't hurt those ferrets." "As a matter of fact," said Crampfurl, "there did used to be one, but when I showed him where it was, like he didn't take no notice of it. Just there. He just stood there, waiting for me to go." Crampfurl laughed. "Two can play at that game, I thought, so I just sits myself down. And there we were, just the two of us. Well, what happened? Then off he'd go in the end, leaving his ferret. I waited for a bit, but it never came out. I poked around a bit and I whistled. Pity I never heard properly what it was called. Uncle something, it sounded like." Arrietty heard the sudden scrape of a chair. "Well," said Crampfurl, "I'd better get on now and shut up those chickens." The door banged with a sudden clatter overhead, and Mrs. Driver began to rake the stove. Arrietty replaced the stool and stole softly into the sitting roots. Wait, let me repeat that. Arrietty replaced the stool and stole softly in the sitting room, where she found her mother alone. Chapter 13. Homily was ironing, bending, and banging, and pushing the hair back out of her eyes. All around the room, underclothes hung airing on safety pins, which Homily used like coat hangers. "What happened?" asked Homily. "Did you fall over?" "Yes," said Arrietty, moving quickly into her place beside the fire. "How's the feeling coming?" "Oh, I don't know," said Arrietty. She clasped her knees and laid her chin on them. "Where's your knitting?" "I don't know. What's come over you lately? You're always idle, always still. You don't feel seedy, do you, or sick?" "Oh," exclaimed Arrietty, "let me be." And Homily for once was silent. "It's the spring," she told herself. "It used to take me like that sometimes at her age. I must see that boy," Arrietty was thinking, staring blindly into the fire. "I must hear what happened. I must hear if they are all right. I don't want us to die out. I don't want to be the last borrower, and I don't want. And here Ariadne dropped her face onto her knees. I don't want to live forever and ever like this in the dark under the floor. No good getting supper, said Homily, breaking the silence. Your father's gone borrowing. To her room, and you know what that means. Ari raised her head. No, she said, hardly listening. What does that mean? That he won't be back, said Homily sharply, for a good hour and a half. He likes it up there, gossiping with her and poking about on the dressing table, and it's safe enough once that little boy's in bed. Not that there's anything special we want, she just went on. It's just new shelves he's made. They kind of look bare. He says, and he might just pick up a little something for them. Ariadne suddenly was sitting bolt upright. A thought had struck her, leaving her breathless and a little shaky at the knees. An hour and a half, her mother had said, and the gates would be open. Where are you going? Asked Homily as Ariadne moved toward the door. I'm just going along to the storeroom, said Ariadne, shading with one hand her candle dip from the draught. I won't be long. Now, don't you untidy anything, Homily called out after her, and be careful of that light. As Ariadne went down the passage, she thought, it is true, I am going to the storerooms to find another hat pin, and if I do find a hat pin and a piece of string, I still won't be long, because I'll have to get back before Papa, and I'm doing it for their sakes, she told herself, and one day they'll thank me, and the same she felt a little guilty. There was a hat pin, one with a bar for a top, and she tied a piece of string very firmly, twisting it back and forth like a figure of 8, and as a crowning inspiration, she sealed it with some sealing wax. The gates were open, and she left the candle in the middle of the passage where it could come to no harm, just below the hole of the clock. The great hall, when she had climbed out into it, was dim with shadows. A single gas jet turned low made a pool of light beside the locked front door, and another faintly flickered on the landing halfway up the stairs. The ceiling sprang away into height and darkness, and all around was space. The night nursery, she knew, was at the end of the upstairs passage. I think when they say passage, they mean hallway. The upstairs passage, and the boy would be in bed. Her mother had just said so. Ariadne had watched her father use his pin on the chair, and single stairs in comparison were easier. There was a kind of rhythm to it after all, a throw, a pull, a scramble, and an upward swing. The stair rods glinted coldly, but the pile of the carpet seemed soft and warm and delicious to fall back on. On the half landing, she paused to get her breath. She did not mind the darkness. She lived in the darkness. She was at home in it, and at a time like this, it made her feel safe. On the upper landing, she saw an open door and a great square of golden light, which like a barrier lay across the passage. I've got to pass through that, Ariadne told herself, trying to be brave. Inside the lighted room, a voice was talking and droning on, and this mare, the voice said, was a 5-year-old, which really belonged to my brother in Ireland. Not my elder brother, but my younger brother, the one who owned Stalemate. And oh, my darling, he had entered for several points, but when I say several, I mean 2 or 3. Have you ever seen an Irish point to point? No, said another voice. That's my father, Ariadne realized with a start. My father's talking to Great Aunt Sophie, or rather, Great Aunt Sophie's talking to my father. She gripped her pin with its loops of string and ran into the light and through the passage beyond, and as she passed the open door, she had a glimpse of firelight and lamplight and gleaming furniture and dark red silk brocade. Beyond the square of light, the passage was dark again, and she could see at the far end a half-open door. That's the day nursery, she thought, and beyond it is the night nursery. There are certain differences. Aunt Sophie's voice went on, which would strike you at once. For instance, Ariadne liked her voice. It was comforting and steady, like the sound of the clock in the hall as she moved off the carpet on the strip of polished floor beside the skirting board. She was interested to hear there were walls in Ireland instead of hedges. Here, by the skirting, she could run, and she loved running. Carpets were heavy, going thick and clinging. They held you up. The boards were smooth and smelled of beeswax, and she liked that smell. The schoolroom, when she reached it, was covered in dust, sheets, and full of junk. Here, too, a gas jet burn turned low to a bluish flame. The floor was linoleum, rather worn, and the rugs were shabby. Under the table was a great cavern of darkness. She moved it, feeling about, and bumped into a dusty hassock higher than her head. Coming out again into the half-light, she looked up and saw the corner cupboard with a doll's tea service, the painting above a fireplace, and the plush curtain where her father had been seen. Chair legs were everywhere, and chair seats obscured her view. Obscured her view means blocked. She found her way among them to the door of the night nursery, and there she saw a shadowed plateau in the far corner, the boy in bed. She saw his great face and turned toward her on the edge of the pillow. She saw the gaslight reflected in his eyes open. She saw his hand gripping the bedclothes, holding them tightly pressed against his mouth. She stopped moving and stood still, and after a while, when she saw his fingers relax, she said, "Don't be frightened. It's just me, Ariadne." He let the bedclothes slide away from his mouth and said, Ari, whatty?" He seemed annoyed. "Eddie," she repeated gently. "Did you take the letter?" He stared at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Why did you come creeping into my room like that?" "I didn't come creeping," said Ariadne. "I even ran. Didn't you see?" He was silent, staring at her with his great wide open eyes. "When I brought the book," he said at last, "you were gone. I had to go. Tea was ready. My father fetched me. He understood this." "Oh," he said matter-of-factly, and did not say it again. "Did you take the letter?" she asked again. "Yes," he said. "I had to go back twice. I shoved it down the badger's hole." Suddenly, he threw back the bedclothes and stood up, enormous in his pale flannel t-shirt, or nightshirt, rather. It was Ariadne's turn to be afraid. She half turned her eyes on his face and began backing slowly toward the door. But he did not look at her. He was feeling behind a picture on the wall. "Here it is," he said, sitting down again, and the bed creaked loudly. "But I don't want it back," exclaimed Ariadne, coming forward. "You should have left the letter there. Why would you bring it back?" He turned it over in his fingers. "It's written on," he said. "Please," cried Ariadne excitedly, "show me." She ran up into the bed and tugged at the trailing sheet. "Then they're alive. Did you see them?" "No," he said. "The letter was there, just down the hole where I put it." He leaned toward her. But he's written on it. Look." She made a quick dart and almost snatched the letter out of his fingers, but was careful to keep out of range of his hand. She ran with it to the door of the schoolroom, where the light, though dim, was still brighter. "It's very faint," she said, holding it close to her eyes. What's he written it with, I wonder? "It's all in capitals." She turned suddenly. "Are you sure you didn't write it?" she asked. "Of course not," he began. "I write small." But she had seen by his face that he spoke the truth, and began to spell out the letters. "T-E-double-I," she said. "Tell your Y-O-U-Y-O-R-E." She looked up. "Yes," the boy. Tell your aunt, A-N-T, aunt." "Yes," said Ariadne. "Aunt, my aunt?" The boy was silent, and he was waiting. "Aunt L-U, oh, Aunt Loopy." He says, "Listen, this is what he says. Tell your Aunt Loopy to come home." There was silence. "Then tell her," said the boy after a moment. "But she isn't here," exclaimed Ariadne. "She's never been here. I don't even remember what she looked like." "Look," said the boy, staring through the door. "Someone is coming." Ariadne whipped around. There was no time to hide. It was Pod, borrowing bag in one hand and pin in the other. He stood in the doorway of the schoolroom. Quite still he stood, outlined against the light in the passage. His little shadow falling dimly in front of him. He had seen her. "I heard your voice," he said, and there was a dreadful quietness about the way he spoke. "Just as I was coming out of her room." Ariadne stared back at him. stuffing the letter up her shirt. Could he see beyond her into the shadowed room? Could he see that shape in the bed? Come home, said Pod, and he turned away.